This is the third video for chapter 27, and it's on acid-base balance. So what we're talking about here are a balance of acids and bases and salts. So the first thing we want to do is go back and review pH. So pH basically is the power of hydrogen. So it's how many hydrogen are in solution. On a pH scale of 0 to 14, 7 is right in the middle, and that is considered a neutral pH. Any number, any pH that is higher than 7 is considered alkaline, and any pH that is lower than 7 is considered acidic. So we're really looking at the concentration of hydrogen in a solution. If a solution has less hydrogen, it's considered alkaline, and if it has more hydrogen, it's considered acidic. And the more hydrogen it has, the lower the pH will go, and the less hydrogen a solution has, the higher the pH would go. So, for example, the pH of blood is 7.35 to 7.45. So it is slightly alkaline because it's above a pH of 7. If the pH goes below 6.8, or if it goes above 7.7, that can lead to death. It's really important to try to keep the pH of the blood and the extracellular fluids between 7.35 and 7.45. Buffers oppose changes in the pH by removing or replacing hydrogens. So if the blood becomes more acidic, buffers will remove hydrogen. And if the blood becomes more alkaline, buffers will add hydrogen. So they're always trying to keep the pH in the proper range. The control of pH is called acid-base balance. Three things in the body help to keep the pH within normal limits. Buffer systems, which we're going to talk about in this chapter, as well as the renal system, or the kidneys, and also the respiratory system, or the lungs. So throughout this chapter, we're going to look at how these three things help to keep the pH between 7.35 and 7.45. If the pH is below 7.35, then the blood is acidic, and we call that acidemia. The physiological state of acidemia is called acidosis. So we would say a person is in a state of acidosis. Severe acidosis is below 7.0. This acidemia can interrupt the central nervous system function. It can lead to a coma. It can lead to weak and irregular cardiac contractions, and even heart failure. It can cause peripheral vasodilation and cause a decrease in blood pressure. And it can cause, because of that, can cause a circulatory collapse. If the pH is above 7.45, that in the blood, that's called alkalemia, and the person would be in the state of alkalosis. This is less common than acidosis. A person might experience nausea and vomiting, hand tremors, muscle twitching, and tingling in the extremities and face. Let's look at the different acids that are in the body. There are volatile acids. Volatile acids are acids that enter and leave through the environment, so you're either breathing them in through the lungs for example, carbonic acid, which we've talked about. Carbonic acid forms when carbon dioxide and water combine together. There are also fixed acids. Fixed acids don't leave the body, so they don't leave solution until they're excreted by the kidney. These types of acids are generated through the catabolism of amino acids. So when we break down amino acids, these create fixed acids. Then we have organic acids. Organic acids are byproducts of metabolism. So they include things like pyruvic acid, lactic acid, ketone bodies, right? So ketones are formed from the breakdown of lipids. They can accumulate during starvation or excessive lipids catabolism. For instance, if a person is on a diet where all they're eating is high proteins and they're not eating anything else, no carbs or anything like that, then the body breaks down an excess amount of lipids. And under normal conditions, these organic acids are not going to accumulate. So it's really only abnormal conditions where we're going to see an unusually high number of organic acids. So instances like starvation, or if you're on some type of diet where all you're doing is eating a high protein and no carbs. The partial pressure of carbon dioxide is the most important factor affecting the pH of the blood. Most of the carbon dioxide in your body will combine with water to produce carbonic acid, and then carbonic acid will immediately dissociate into hydrogen ions and bicarbonate. So remember, it's the number of hydrogen that are going to determine if the blood is acidic or alkaline, but it's actually carbon dioxide that's the most important factor in determining how much hydrogen is actually found in the blood and extracellular fluids. So the partial pressure of carbon dioxide is actually inversely related to the pH. And so what I mean by that is when you have an increase in carbon dioxide, then additional hydrogen and bicarbonate are released, so the pH decreases. So if you have an increase in carbon dioxide, you're going to have a decrease in pH. A decrease in pH means you have an increase in hydrogen ions. So if we look at this equation at the top, you should note that when you have an increase in carbon dioxide, then this equation is going to shift to the right. And this additional carbon dioxide will bind to hydrogen to form carbonic acid, which will then dissociate into hydrogen. So if you have an increase in carbon dioxide, you're going to have an increase in hydrogen, which is what I said down here. If you have an increase in carbon dioxide, you're going to have an increase in hydrogen. and an increase in hydrogen is a decrease in pH. So we say that carbon dioxide and pH are inversely related. Because if you have an increase in carbon dioxide, you're going to have a decrease in pH. And a decrease in pH is acidic. And so this is why we say in the body that carbon dioxide really acts as an acid, because if you have increased CO2, you have increased hydrogen, which makes it more acidic. So let's look at what happens if you have a decrease in CO2. So if we have a decrease in CO2 and it's below the level that it should be, we have to bring that back up. What will happen in that case is hydrogen will combine with bicarbonate to create carbonic acid, and then carbonic acid will immediately dissociate into water and carbon dioxide. So that'll bring the carbon dioxide levels back up. So let's look at this again and let's put this into words. If CO2 increases, that causes hydrogen to be produced. That causes the pH to decrease, and that makes the blood and the extracellular fluid acidic. On the other hand, if CO2 decreases, that causes hydrogen to be pulled from solution, so to be pulled from the extracellular fluid to produce more carbon dioxide. Pulling the hydrogen from solution makes that solution more alkaline. Let's take a closer look at hydrogen. So hydrogen are gained through the digestive tract, so they're gained through diet and drink. And they're also gained through the metabolism. And then hydrogen, if it's brought in through the diet and the drink, it's absorbed through the GI tract into the blood, and then it goes to the kidneys or to the lungs. In the blood, hydrogen is neutralized by buffers. In the kidneys, hydrogen is secreted in exchange for sodium. So it'll end up in the urine. And at the lungs, hydrogen combines with bicarbonate to produce carbonic acid, which will dissociate into carbon dioxide and water. And then carbon dioxide is eliminated through your breath as you breathe out. So we're going to take a look at the buffer systems in the body. Then we'll look at the kidneys and the lungs, and then we'll start to look at some disorders of either alkalosis or acidosis. So like I said before, buffers stabilize the pH. They do this by either adding or removing hydrogen. Buffers include weak acids that donate hydrogen. For example, carbonic acid is a weak acid, and so it donates hydrogen by dissociating into hydrogen and bicarbonate. And buffers can also be weak bases that can absorb hydrogen. These buffer systems provide only a temporary solution, though. They don't remove the hydrogen from the body. All they do is they tie it up for a little bit of time. In order to completely remove hydrogen, the hydrogen has to be either permanently tied up in a water molecule, or it has to be removed by the lungs as it's converted to CO2, or it has to be removed as hydrogen through the secretion by the kidneys. There are three major buffer systems. There's the protein buffer system, the carbonic acid, bicarbonate buffer system, and there's the phosphate buffer system. The phosphate buffer system helps to release or absorb hydrogen. And it helps to buffer the pH of the intracellular fluid and urine. The protein buffer system depends on amino acids. So in the protein buffer system, amino acids absorb or release hydrogen. This buffer system can't make rapid or large-scale pH adjustments. But it's still really important to both the extracellular fluid and the intracellular fluid. It actually prevents destructive changes when lactic acid or pyruvic acid are formed in metabolism. A specialized protein buffer system is called the hemoglobin buffer system. This is the only intracellular buffer system that can have an immediate effect on the pH of the extracellular fluid. So it's an intracellular fluid buffer system that can immediately affect the extracellular fluid pH. In this hemoglobin buffer system, carbon dioxide diffuses into the red blood cell. In the red blood cell, it combines with water to create carbonic acid. And then that immediately dissociates into bicarbonate and hydrogen. And so carbon dioxide, we've said this in the respiratory system, is carried as bicarbonate. So this special protein buffer system helps to prevent drastic changes in pH when the CO2 increases or decreases while you're breathing. The last buffer system is the carbonic acid bicarbonate buffer system. Here, carbonic acid and its dissociation products The primary role of this buffer system is to prevent changes in pH caused by metabolic acids and fixed acids in the extracellular fluid. So it's trying to prevent pH changes with the whenever pyruvic acid is being produced, or lactic acid is being produced, or ketone bodies are being produced, or when amino acids are being broken down. So with this buffer system, if hydrogen are added, they will combine with bicarbonate to produce carbonic acid, which will immediately break down into water and carbon dioxide. And then carbon dioxide can be breathed out by the lungs. When hydrogen are added, this means that the pH is lower. So this means that the pH is acidic. If hydrogen are removed, so hydrogen levels drop, that means that the pH is higher or alkaline. So if the blood becomes alkaline, then carbonic acid will break down into hydrogen and bicarbonate, and then that will give us the additional hydrogen to bring the level back up to normal. In order for us to make carbonic acid, then carbon dioxide and hydrogen have to combine together to form that. There are limitations to this buffer system, to the carbonic acid bicarbonate buffer system. First of all, it can't protect the extracellular fluid from pH changes that result from increased or decreased levels of CO2. We saw this in the equation because if CO2 levels go up, CO2 will combine with water to form carbonic acid. Then carbonic acid dissociates into hydrogen. So when we have an increase in CO2, we're going to have an increase in hydrogen. Therefore, this system can't protect the pH changes from an increased or a decreased CO2. The second limitation is that buffering is limited by the availability of bicarbonate ions. If all the bicarbonate is tied up, then buffering is not possible because we need hydrogen ions to bind to the bicarbonate to form carbonic acid. If we don't have the bicarbonate because it's tied up, then the hydrogen can't be buffered by this system. Luckily, a lack of bicarbonate is rare. And this is because the kidney produces bicarbonate. So with all of these buffer systems, they tie up the excess hydrogen, but they provide only a temporary solution to an acid-base imbalance. The hydrogen are merely rendered harmless, but they're not eliminated from the body. In order to preserve homeostasis, the captured hydrogen have to ultimately be either permanently tied up by water molecules, or they have to be removed by the lungs as CO2, or the hydrogen have to be secreted into the renal tubule and removed as urine. So now we're going to look at the respiratory and the renal systems. Both of these systems can secrete or absorb hydrogen. They can control the excretion of hydrogen or bicarbonate. They can generate additional buffers, and they can maintain the pH by combining with buffer systems. Let's look at the respiratory system first. The respiratory system can increase or decrease CO2. When the PCO2 is increased, that will cause hydrogen to be increased, and that means that the pH falls and it becomes acidic. When the PCO2 is decreased, that means hydrogen will decrease, and that means that the pH rises or becomes alkaline. When the pH becomes out of normal limits, and you remember what the normal limits are, right? The pH of blood is what? 7.35 to 7.45. So when the pH is out of normal limits, then respiratory compensation has to occur. Respiratory compensation is a change in the respiratory rate. To compensate and help to stabilize the pH of the extracellular fluid. For example, if hydrogen increases, then that will create more carbonic acid, and that will dissociate into carbon dioxide and water, and then the respiratory rate will have to increase to get rid of the carbon dioxide. So if the hydrogen increase, that means that the pH decreased. That means that the extracellular fluid is acidic. So if the extracellular fluid is acidic and it has too much hydrogen, then that will produce more carbon dioxide, and then the respiratory rate will have to increase to get rid of it. On the other hand, if hydrogen levels decrease, then carbonic acid will have to dissociate into hydrogen in order to bring that back up, and in order to dissociate into that, we need to retain more carbon dioxide, and so to retain more carbon dioxide, your respiratory rate will decrease because you don't want to be getting rid of the carbon dioxide, you want to be holding it into your body. So we need to sustain the carbon dioxide levels in the blood and to let the carbon dioxide build up so your respiratory rate will decrease. Then the carbon dioxide can combine with water to form carbonic acid, which will dissociate into hydrogen so that your hydrogen levels go back up. So this is what happens if hydrogen decreases, and if hydrogen decreases, that means your pH has gone up, and that means that your blood is alkaline. So that's how your respiratory compensation works. So the renal system or the urinary system can also help to keep the pH in normal range. Whereas the respiratory system was more sensitive to carbon dioxide levels, the renal system responds to changes in plasma hydrogen levels. Large quantities of hydrogen can be removed at the kidneys in the urine. Sodium gets reabsorbed, and hydrogen gets secreted. This helps to keep the pH in normal limits. However, when the pH gets out of normal limits, then renal compensation has to occur. And in order for renal compensation to occur, buffers have to be present. So buffers will be used. To correct a decrease in blood pH, so if we have a decrease in blood pH, that means we have an excess of hydrogen that we have to get rid of. Then the hydrogen is secreted into the renal tubule. And then the hydrogen is absorbed by the buffer system. So hydrogen combines with bicarbonate. So bicarbonate is in the urine. This is the buffer that's present in the urine. And then that will combine to form carbonic acid, which dissociates into carbon dioxide and water. The CO2 will be removed by the respiratory system by increasing the respiratory rate. In addition to that, the bicarbonate that is produced in the kidney will be reabsorbed along with sodium. So sodium will be reabsorbed and bicarbonate will be reabsorbed. They'll be reabsorbed as sodium bicarbonate. So now we have we're not only getting rid of carbon dioxide, but we're also reabsorbing sodium bicarbonate in order to buffer the blood and to make the blood more alkaline or to increase the blood pH. To correct the opposite problem, if we have an increase in blood pH, this means the blood is alkaline and it has less hydrogen. In this case, hydrogen won't be secreted, so it won't be eliminated in the urine. This also means that sodium bicarbonate won't be reabsorbed. And instead, bicarbonate will be secreted. Which means it'll be eliminated in the urine. When bicarbonate decreases, this will force carbonic acid to dissociate into bicarbonate and hydrogen. So this will increase the number of hydrogen ions, and those ions will be reabsorbed. When the hydrogen are reabsorbed, that means that there will be more hydrogen in the blood, which will decrease the pH. And that helps to compensate for what we saw where there was an increase in blood pH. Now we will decrease the blood pH and bring it back to normal. So now we're going to look at acid-base disorders. An acid-base disorder is a pathological change in the partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the blood or in the plasma. And because CO2 levels correspond to levels of hydrogen in the blood, remember if you have increased CO2, that means you have increased hydrogen because of the equation. That means that if you have abnormal CO2 levels, you're going to have an abnormal level of hydrogen ions, which means the pH will be abnormal. An acidosis means that the pH is low, and an alkalosis means that the pH is high. So we're going to talk about individual acid-base disorders, and then we're going to look at how you would identify an acid-base disorder. So we'll be looking at respiratory acid-base disorders, and we'll be looking at metabolic acid-base disorders. So a respiratory acid-base disorder is when the respiratory system is the cause of the disorder. And what I mean by that is either the person is breathing out too fast, so they're breathing too much carbon dioxide out, they're breathing too fast, or they're breathing too slow. With a metabolic acid-base disorder, this is a problem where the tissues are generating acids, fixed or organic acids, at an abnormal rate. Or they're losing the acids at an abnormal rate. So if we go back and look at the respiratory acid-base disorder, if a person is breathing too fast, so they're puffing out air, they're hyperventilating, they are losing carbon dioxide too fast. So if they're losing carbon dioxide, then their PCO2, their partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the extracellular fluid, is going to be low. On the other hand, if they're breathing too slowly, that means they're not getting out enough of the carbon dioxide that the tissues have generated. So that means the carbon dioxide is going to stay in the blood, and their PCO2 will then be high. If their PCO2 is low, that means that their hydrogen levels are going to be low, and that means that their pH will be high. And if the pH is high, this means that they have an alkalosis. And since the respiratory system was the cause, this then is called a respiratory alkalosis. On the other hand, if they're breathing too slowly and their PCO2 is high because they're not getting it out and it's staying in their blood, this means their PCO2 will be high in the blood. That means that their hydrogen levels will be high in the blood, and that means that their pH will be low. If the pH is low, that means they're acidic, so they have an acidosis. And because the respiratory system is the cause, this means that they have a respiratory acidosis. So now let's look at metabolic disorders. So if they are producing too many acids, too many fixed or organic acids, either through exercise, strenuous exercise, or through like an uncontrolled diabetes, and they have too many acids generated, that means that they are going to have a high hydrogen level, and that means that their pH is going to be low. If their pH is low, that means that they have an acidosis. And because the problem was with the tissues, that means they have a metabolic acidosis. If, on the other hand, they're getting rid of acids too quickly, for instance, if they're vomiting and diarrhea and they're getting rid of these acids at a very high rate, then acids are removed too quickly from the body, so they don't have enough acids then in their extracellular fluid, so they have low hydrogen, and that means that their pH then is high. If their pH is high, that means they have an alkalosis. And because they're just losing too many acids, too many hydrogen too quickly, then that is a metabolic problem. So then it's a metabolic alkalosis. So let's look at some mechanisms for these disorders. So we'll go back up to respiratory. So when a person is breathing too fast and they're breathing out carbon dioxide too quickly, we call that hyperventilation. So when a person is hyperventilating and they're breathing too fast, Their carbon dioxide levels are leaving their body too fast, so they're low in the blood. That means their pH will be high, and that means they have a respiratory alkalosis if the pH is out of normal. Now remember again that the pH is 7.35 to 7.45. That's normal. So if the pH is high, if it's above 7.45, and it's because the person was hyperventilating, that would be a respiratory alkalosis. When we're talking about carbon dioxide levels and we're saying that carbon dioxide is low in the plasma, that term that we use for low carbon dioxide is hypocapnia. Hypocapnia, low carbon dioxide. So now let's look at when a person is breathing too slowly. The mechanism for this disorder would be called hypoventilation. Hypoventilation. So this means that they are not breathing as fast as they should. They're breathing too slow. This means that they're holding too much carbon dioxide in their body and they're not breathing it out fast enough, so they have high CO2 levels. And when we have high CO2 levels, that is called hypercapnia. So now let's take a look at the physiological causes of these disorders. So hyperventilation. We know when a person is hyperventilating, it could be because of anxiety. But there's some other clinical causes as well to this. Perhaps a person has a brainstem injury. So they've got an injury to that respiratory center that's helping to set the respiratory rate. Perhaps they are on a mechanical respirator. Sometimes mechanical respirators will cause them to breathe too quickly. So then let's look at some of the physiological causes of hypoventilation. So hypoventilation is not breathing fast enough, and it can be an acute respiratory hypoventilation, and this would be from choking. So that would be a really very acute form of hypoventilation that would have to be attended to very quickly. But otherwise, there are more chronic hypoventilations, such as from barbiturate use. So barbiturates or alcohol or opioids or other disorders like pneumonia or congestive heart failure. These things can all cause hypoventilation with a subsequent respiratory acidosis. So now let's look at the metabolic acid-base disorders again. And we'll start by looking at when a person has too many acids being generated. So some of the causes of too many acids include lactic acidosis. In lactic acidosis, this means that there's a lot of lactic acid being produced, and this is going to happen in strenuous exercise. So the physiological cause would be strenuous exercise. So they're exercising heavily and they're producing a lot of pyruvate, and pyruvate then converts to lactate, and lactate combines with the hydrogen to form lactic acid. So there's too many acids being formed. That's one cause. Another mechanism for having too many acids being generated is ketoacidosis. So ketoacidosis can be caused from starvation. So the brain needs to have energy, and so when you're starving your body, the brain will then break down lipids in order to produce energy, and so when lipids get broken down, they produce these ketone bodies. Too many ketone bodies then cause a ketoacidosis. Another way that ketoacidosis occurs is through uncontrolled diabetes. So when a person has diabetes and the cells can't get to the glucose because the cells are not responding to insulin, so glucose can't enter the cells. Then the cells are going to start breaking down lipids, and again, breaking down those lipids will generate ketone bodies, causing ketoacidosis. In addition to having too many acids being generated, there might also be a situation where too much bicarbonate is being lost. So here where I was saying that metabolic acidosis always is caused by too many acids being generated, it can also be caused by a severe bicarbonate loss. This situation can happen during a condition called glomerulonephritis. This is a kidney disorder. It's a chronic kidney disease, and it causes excess bicarbonate to be excreted as it's trying to help maintain the hydrogen balance. Another cause of having too low of bicarbonate or having severe bicarbonate loss would be diarrhea. So either one of these will cause an acidosis. Either you're producing too many acids or you're losing too many bases, which is bicarbonate. And again, since you have too acidic of plasma, that means that your pH is low and that person has metabolic acidosis. The last disorder that we're going to look at is when acids are removed too quickly. And this condition is more rare, so we don't see this very often. But when we do see it, sometimes it can be caused by repeated vomiting. So we might see this in patients that are bulimic, or if they have an illness where they're vomiting severely. So as they're vomiting, they lose hydrogen because the stomach is very acidic, so they're losing hydrogen. So their stomach cells are going to work very hard to produce more hydrogen. So when they produce hydrogen, they have to have chloride to go along with it. And remember that chloride shift. So when chloride is brought in to combine with hydrogen ions to form hydrochloric acid, at the same time, bicarbonate is going to be reabsorbed back into the body. So then they have that case where they have too much bicarbonate in the body then. Now I want to look at one last thing that we look at when we're trying to determine an acid-base disorder, and that is called the anion gap. So if you remember what anions are, anions have a negative charge. And we're going to look at the gap between the anions and the cations. So the anion gap is the gap or the comparison between anions and cations. And remember, cations then have a positive charge. So anions have a negative charge and cations have a positive charge. So in acidosis, the gap is going to be increased. The three ions that we're going to be looking at are sodium and bicarbonate and chloride. The normal sodium levels, the normal sodium concentration in your plasma is 135 to 145 milliequivalents per liter. The normal bicarbonate in your body is 22 to 26 milliequivalents per liter. And the normal range of chloride in your plasma is between 96 to 106 milliequivalents per liter. The equation to figure out the anion gap is the sodium concentration minus the bicarbonate concentration plus the chloride concentration. The normal anion gap will be between 3 to 10 milliequivalents per liter. Anything that is high could suggest an acidosis. which again could indicate diarrhea, too much exercise, uncontrolled diabetes, dehydration. If the anion gap is low, a common cause of this is hypoalbuminemia. So this is low albumin in your blood, and if you remember what albumin is, it's one of those plasma proteins, and the plasma protein is negatively charged, and it helps to retain other negatively charged ions such as chloride and bicarbonate. So when we get together in lab, we're going to go over a couple of different situations with looking at the anion gap. And so you'll be given the sodium and the bicarbonate and the chloride levels, and you'll be taking a look at the gap and seeing, is it too high or is it low, or is it right in between 3 to 10 milliequivalents per liter. All right, then that ends this video for chapter 27, and you'll want to watch the other video where we look at other ways to detect whether a person has a metabolic alkalosis or acidosis. You'll be using that information in our next lab when we break out into small groups.